You'll be amazed. During the sinking of the Titanic, one man survived by drinking 2 bottles of whiskey in one gulp before jumping into the water. He managed to stay in the icy water for over 2 hours without freezing. How's that even possible? In this video, I'll tell you the most amazing, interesting, and shocking facts about the Titanic disaster. And at the end of the video, I'll tell you one of the most gripping stories about a woman who not only survived the sinking of this liner, but also its brothers. Enjoy watching. And the very first fact I wanted to tell you about is actually very astonishing. You see, there were 3 classes of passengers on the Titanic. The first, naturally, was the best, and it was these passengers who had the main privileges. The second class was simpler. And the third, you could say, was the poor. Why do I think so? Just imagine, for 700 third-class people, there were only 2 baths. It's outrageous! But this information is even more surprising when you consider the conditions on the Titanic. Just imagine, this huge ship on board had a tennis court, a swimming pool, European and Turkish baths, a winter garden, a full-size roller skating rink, a golf course, a gym, a garage for cars, a hospital with an equipped operating room, a post office, a library, and many other rooms. Essentially, it was a full-fledged floating city with literally everything. And knowing all this, it really astonishes me how 700 people shared only 2 baths. Dreadful. But an even greater outrage can be caused by the next story. You've probably all heard the story of how during the Titanic sinking, the orchestra on board played their music all the time to cheer up the passengers. And this is not a made-up story from a popular movie, but a real fact described by all the survivors. So, all the musicians perished on that dreadful day. Or did they? It turns out, according to documents, one musician was alive until the year 2000. Roger Bricoux, who worked as a cellist on the Titanic, was 21 at the time of the disaster, and he died along with all the musicians. But for some reason, he was not officially declared dead for almost 90 years. That is, according to documents, the man was alive, which means he should have served in the army. I find this whole situation very amusing because in his native France, Roger was dubbed as deserter for missing service during World War I, even though he had long been dead. But there are much sadder facts that can truly shock. For example, the lookouts, who were on duty around the clock on the ship reporting the approach of dangerous icebergs, did not have access to binoculars. Just imagine, you need to report dangerous objects in the sea in advance, and you literally see nothing. What did this lead to? Well, the unfortunate huge iceberg that sank the Titanic was only spotted 37 seconds before the collision. In that time, of course, it was impossible to change the course of the multi-ton machine, which was speeding towards its death. So, no actions of the crew could help, and the ship still sank. How did it happen that the lookouts didn't have binoculars? The thing is, they were locked in a cabinet. There were only 2 lookouts, one of whom was called to work at the last moment. He was supposed to replace another person, and that person, in turn, simply forgot to hand over the key to the cabinet. These unfortunate binoculars lay locked away. Who knows, maybe they really would have helped to avoid the iceberg and save the ship. But now, only the residents of Atlantis can use these binoculars. Personally, what disturbed and angered me the most was not this fact. Who knows, maybe the disaster was simply unavoidable. But such a large number of victims could have been avoided. Just imagine, during the sinking, 1,517 people out of 2,224 people on board perished. You may ask me, why so many? It's all about the company that prepared the ship for departure. The White Star Line Steamship Company reduced the number of lifeboats from 48 to 16. This order was personally given by the director and manager of the company, Joseph Bruce Ismay. Why? All for the first-class passengers who found these boats obstructive. And it was Joseph who also gave the order to go, so to speak, full steam ahead. Again, all for the comfort of the passengers. However, this fact also played a cruel joke on the ship. The thing is, if the speed had been lower, the crew would have had enough time to avoid a serious collision with the iceberg. In general, I found one of the main culprits of the tragedy. And what do you think? Is Joseph guilty of the sinking and the deaths of almost 700 people? You can share your thoughts on the disaster in the comments, as I read them regularly. Naturally, the small number of lifeboats imposed its limitations. Initially, they were loaded less than halfway, fearing overcrowding, although during tests, they could hold the weight of 70 men. Some of them remained unfilled, and this fact is very alarming. And there's another tragic story about lifeboats. For some reason, the captain cancelled the drills for boarding the lifeboats, and this fact also played a significant role. The thing is, many passengers simply didn't know the way to safety. They didn't know where these boats were located, where to run, and how to quickly and easily board them. So, some victims could have been avoided at this stage. And many more could have survived if the captain of the Californian ship, which was very close to the sinking Titanic, hadn't mistaken its distress signal for a festive salute. It's utterly absurd! As it turned out, there were no red distress signals on the ill-fated ship, so white ones were released into the air. Naturally, from a distance, it may seem like it's not a distress signal, just fireworks. It was only several hours later that the ship's crew realized something was wrong and headed towards the crash site. And the last fact about the lifeboats and rescuing the drowning, which deeply saddens me. The officers in charge of these boats were also responsible for rescuing all those in the water, but they didn't rush to save people. They simply feared that all these people overboard would overturn the boats. So the lifeboats just stood by and watched as passengers drowned one after another and froze to death. A horrifying sight. Well, let's not dwell on the sad. It's time to liven up my video with a very interesting and amazing story. One of the cooks, if you don't know, that's a chef on the ship, decided that before dying, one must have a drink. So, according to eyewitness accounts, Charles Jockin took and literally poured 2 bottles of whiskey into himself. And what do you think? No, he didn't pass out from alcohol poisoning or rush into the bathroom to empty his stomach. He spent no less than 2 hours in icy water, while other passengers died from hypothermia within just 15 minutes. Jockin even appeared in James Cameron's Titanic movie. Granted, he was given very little time in the film. But I want to warn you, my viewers, that alcohol consumption is harmful to your health, and I by no means approve of such behavior. If you find yourself in a similar situation, it will more likely hinder than help you, so don't repeat such actions. Oh, and since I've already mentioned James Cameron's famous Titanic movie, I can't help but tell you about another amazing fact. The production of this wonderful film cost more than the construction of the ship itself. And this is despite the fact that it featured so many diverse entertainments and luxurious materials. How is this possible? The thing is, in 1912, the Titanic was valued at $7.5 million. In today's money, according to the US Department of Labor's inflation calculator, this amount would be estimated at $190 million. And it took a whopping $200 million to produce the film. Who knows, maybe all these scenes from the blockbuster were not graphics at all, but the real deal. And what do you think all these millions were spent on? And another interesting fact from the world of art. The shipyard where the Titanic was built is now used as a special hangar where filming locations are located. It was there that the famous series Game of Thrones was filmed. Did you know that the captain of the Titanic, Edward Smith, died a hero alongside the ship? Yes, it's a worthy deed, as he could have easily taken one of the spots on the lifeboat, but he remained in charge of the rescue operation until the end. But personally, I feel sad and sorry for this remarkable man. The thing is, Edward had been working as a captain for 40 years before his last voyage. He had been in command of various ships for many years. Naturally, over all this time, he grew tired of his work, and age was catching up with him. The voyage on the Titanic, as I mentioned before, was the last for Smith, in every sense. If the ship hadn't suffered the crash, the captain would have peacefully retired. Although, who knows, maybe he didn't want to retire. That's why he chose to go down with the ship to the bottom of the sea. In any case, I feel sorry for such a sad fate of this man. Oh yes, I almost forgot about some facts about the Titanic. Did you know that it was made of the best steel available at the time? Then why did it sink so easily? This is where the engineer's oversight comes into play. Although they used the highest grade metal, which was extremely strong, they didn't take into account the fact that at low temperatures it became very brittle. And as you probably know, the water at the Titanic's crash site was very low in temperature. Naturally, such steel couldn't withstand a huge iceberg that it encountered in its path. And also, as everyone knows, the ship had 4 towering funnels. This silhouette, I think, is remembered by everyone. But did you know that one of them is essentially a dummy? The 4th funnel was erected purely for decoration. The previous 3 served as smokestacks, and this one was intended for ventilation. But in fact, it wasn't needed for ventilation. Although I think without it, the Titanic would have looked ridiculous. Naturally, not only people in the ship suffered in the crash, but also a huge amount of valuable cargo. Just imagine how much food and alcohol there was. After all, there were over 2,000 people on board, and they all needed to be fed. And bars were quite popular at that time. So, along with a heap of metal, expensive wood, and other beautiful interior items mixed with the personal belongings of passengers, 34 tons of fresh meat, 3.5 tons of bacon, 36,000 oranges, 1,000 loaves of bread, 40,000 fresh eggs, 15,000 bottles of beer, 1,000 bottles of wine, 850 bottles of liquor, and 8,000 cigars went to the bottom of the sea. It seems like SpongeBob and the whole Bikini Bottom had the best feast of all time. I found an even more interesting fact. Did you know that the Titanic had twin brothers? In fact, this ship was just one of 3 transatlantic liners that belonged to the Olympic series. In addition to the Titanic, the Olympic and Britannic were also built. They were all commissioned by the same company, the White Star Line, which I mentioned earlier. But, as it turned out, the fate of only one of the liners was somewhat successful. The thing is, in 1912 the Titanic perished, which is actually what I've been telling you about in this video. In 1916, the Britannic also perished. It was torpedoed by a German mine-laying ship during World War I, and only the Olympic operated more or less successfully until 1935. After that date, it was scrapped. So, fortunately, at least one of these liners didn't suffer a crash. Oh yes, what was I getting at? The fact of the Titanic's twins' existence is not as interesting as the fact that there was one woman who had been on all 3 of these ships. Violet Jessop worked as a stewardess for the White Star Line, and when she was 23 years old, she first boarded the Olympic. By the way, the captain was the same Smith. So, even this ship got into an accident. On September 20, 1911, it collided with another cruiser during maneuvers. Fortunately, no one was injured, but the Olympic required serious repairs. Then, the crew was transferred to the Titanic, and, as you might have guessed, the first and last voyage of this ship became another ordeal for Violet. This woman managed to save herself in lifeboat number 16, and as you know, there were only 16 of them. You could say the stewardess managed to catch the last train. And finally, the story of the Britannic. During World War I, Violet worked as a nurse on its board. She was supposed to provide assistance to the military. However, on November 31st, 1916, the liner was blown up by a mine. Then the evacuation began. Fortunately, there were more lifeboats this time. But even here, the girl wasn't particularly lucky. 2 boats, one of which she was in, were sucked under the ship's working propellers. The girl was very lucky because she hit her head very hard on the keel, but still managed to survive. Personally, I wouldn't ever get close to working for the White Star Line, or ships in general if I were in her place. What kind of luck do you need to have to experience so much? What do you think about this case? In this video, I've told you the most interesting facts about the Titanic's demise. But in reality, they are not over. There are still plenty of interesting stories. So stay tuned for the second part. And don't forget to subscribe to not miss the new release. And thank you for watching.